Welcome to Walking Through the Word for today, and we're seeing a continuation of Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees, but this is mixed into a larger crowd. And so while Jesus has been addressing some of the specific challenges that the Pharisees are, he's also trying to teach. And yet this makes for an interesting little back and forth that we see, and almost a bit of an aside. Now remember, yesterday we were looking at it, and Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and he was talking about who his descendants were, where he was from the beginning, his own testimony, and talking about what it means to be lifted up, and that maybe then you'll believe. But then Jesus turns aside and he talks to the ones who believe him for a minute and says, hey, if you hold to my teachings, then you're really my disciple. Then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, as they're having this conversation, remember the Pharisees are listening. And they're not necessarily catching everything that Jesus said, because we have two things that Jesus shows us here. One, he talks about what it means to be a disciple. He means that you need to just follow, not just listen to what he says, but follow and do and live as he teaches. He who has ears, let them hear. In other words, if you hear what I'm saying, you have to do it. This is not the, hey, do as I say, not as I do. It is both. It is listen to what I say and live it out. That is, in essence, the very definition of discipleship, to put everything else aside and follow the teacher. If you're a disciple of someone, that means that you fully commit to whatever it is that they're teaching, and you fully commit to living in this way. Being a disciple of Jesus is the same way. You can't halfway follow Jesus. You either do it all the way or you're not really a disciple. But Jesus says, if you do this, you're going to know the truth and you will become free. In other words, when you do this, you realize who I am, what I have done. You will place your faith in me and you will be free. Obviously, the Pharisees at this point, they jump in. They're like, wait a minute, hold on. We are Abraham's descendants, they say in verse 33, and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we should be set free? A really weird statement from these guys, because obviously they have omitted and forgotten a very important fact that, yeah, they were slaves. Why do they think Moses showed up and brought them out of Egypt? There was a lot of time between the time of Abraham and the time of Moses. And in that time, in that period, they were slaves. And even now, the Pharisees are refusing to recognize the reality that they are in subjection to another country, and that this has happened time and time again. When the people of Israel were exiled, for goodness sakes, into Babylon and Assyria because they couldn't follow God. They have been under subjugation and slavery constantly. And they're like, well, we've never been slaves. And Jesus, again, they're not understanding, and they're forgetting conveniently. But Jesus says, no, listen, I tell you that anyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. This is Jesus dropping the hint about being adopted into God's family, that when you place your faith in Christ, you will be adopted as a son and a daughter of Jesus. That's what Jesus is saying here. You have no value when you're a slave, and you are a slave to sin. So right now, you have no value. The wages of sin is death, for all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. You are stuck and mired in slavery. You are not as good and righteous as you think you are. Even if you don't remember the fact that you were a slave in the people of Israel, that you were a slave in Egypt, and then you were sent into exile, into Babylon and those places. Even if you've conveniently forgotten that you were under subjugation of the Roman Empire, you are still a slave to sin, to your sinful desires, to your sinful ways. And I am coming to set you free. You have no value right now. You're just a worthless piece of something. But when you enter into God's family, you will belong to it forever. Jesus is setting the stage for what it means. Yeah, you're special, he says in verse 37, because y'all know you're Abraham's descendants. And yes, Abraham's descendants do have a special place in my heart. Yet, you have forgotten what the purpose of Abraham was. Abraham, by faith, looked for me. If you looked like Abraham. In other words, if you were Abraham's children, he says in verse 39, you would do what Abraham did. Abraham, as we know in Hebrews, by faith trusted that the Messiah was going to come. By faith, Abraham lived, and as a result of it, he was declared righteous. Abraham and all of the patriarchs that believed God's promise of a Messiah were saved by that faith. Yet you, he says in verse 37, are instead looking for a way to kill me. You're not looking for what Abraham was looking for. You've got no room for my word in your heart because you have decided that that following the law will save you, not what I'm telling you. But I am telling you in verse 38 that what I've seen in the Father's presence and what is going on, you have heard from the Father. What I'm telling you is exactly what God has been telling you for generations upon generations. And yet they continue to miss it. And we'll finish this conversation tomorrow.